What if I told you slavery didn't truly end in 1865? It just changed its name. Tonight, we uncover the shocking truth about Reconstruction jails and how prison replaced chains. This is a real story from American history that many people were never taught in school. If you want powerful, true crime stories that reveal hidden history, subscribe now and let's begin. The chain snapped tight around his ankle. Isaiah did not scream. He did not fight. He simply stared at the iron ring locked around his leg as the prison guard kicked dust over his bare feet. Around him, dozens of black men stood in a long line, each chained to the next. Some were old, some were barely grown boys. All of them were prisoners. But most of them had not done anything wrong. The sun burned down on the dirt yard of the Alabama jail in 1875. The men were about to be marched out, not to freedom, not to a courtroom, but to a farm miles away where they would work under guns and whips. A guard read their crimes from a paper. Vagrancy, loitering, no proof of employment. The words sounded small, almost harmless, but those small words had just stolen their lives. Isaiah swallowed hard. He had been free only 10 years, free since the end of slavery, free since the day Union soldiers came riding through and told his family they no longer belonged to a master. Now he stood in chains again, and this time the chains came from a jail. The line of men began to move forward. A wagon waited beyond the gate. White men on horseback watched with rifles across their laps. Isaiah took one step, then another, and as the jail door slammed behind him, a terrible question filled his mind. Had freedom ever really come at all? The wagon rolled away in a cloud of dust. And that was only the beginning. Years earlier, when the Civil War ended in 1865, hope had spread across the South like a sunrise. Enslaved people were told they were free, families reunited, churches filled with songs. Many believed the nightmare was over. This period was called Reconstruction. The federal government promised to rebuild the South and protect the rights of newly freed black citizens. New laws were passed. Black men voted. Some even held office. But not everyone accepted this new world. Many white Southerners were angry. They had lost the war. They had lost enslaved labor, and they did not want black people to have power. So they found another way. They turned to the law. Southern states began passing what were called black codes. These laws made small actions into crimes, but only for black people. If a black man didn't have proof of a job, he could be arrested for vagrancy. If he gathered with friends after sunset, he could be charged with loitering. If he spoke loudly to a white person, he could be accused of disorderly conduct. The charges sounded minor, but the punishment was not. Arrest meant jail, and jail meant something far worse than a cell. At first, prisons were small and overcrowded. After the war, Southern states were poor. They did not want to spend money feeding prisoners. So they created a system called Convict leasing. Here's how it worked. A prisoner would be arrested, often unfairly. Then the state would lease that prisoner to a private business, a farm owner, a railroad company, a coal mine. The business would pay the state a fee. In return, they got labor. Cheap labor. Forced labor. Armed guards watched the prisoners. Whips enforced obedience. Food was scarce. Shelter was rough. If a man became sick or injured, he was often left to die. The company could simply request another prisoner. And because police kept arresting black men under minor charges, there was always another prisoner. It was slavery in a new form. But this time, it was legal.
Isaiah had been arrested while walking along a road searching for work. He had no paper proving employment. That was enough. The judge did not listen long. There was no real defense, no jury of his peers. The sentence was short on paper, 6 months, but under convict leasing, that 6 months could stretch much longer. Once leased, prisoners had no protection. Some were rearrested on new charges before they could leave. Others died before their sentence ended. Families often didn't know where their loved ones were taken. The quiet streets of small southern towns began to hide a terrible secret. Jails were filling fast. In some counties, nearly every prisoner was black, yet black people made up less than half the population. The pattern was clear: arrest, lease, labor, again and again. In Georgia, reports showed that by the 1870s, over 90% of leased convicts were black men. In Mississippi and Alabama, similar numbers appeared. This was not random crime. This was control. Nighttime became frightening. Freedmen feared walking alone. A simple argument could lead to arrest. A false accusation could mean years in chains. And violence followed. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror to keep black citizens from voting or owning land. If threats didn't work, jail might. Because once a man was labeled a criminal, his rights could be stripped away. Voting rights, land ownership, even safety. Some white officials openly admitted the goal was to maintain order. But whose order? Churches began to speak about the injustice. Northern newspapers reported on prison deaths. A few federal investigators tried to intervene, but Reconstruction was losing strength. By the mid-1870s, federal troops began leaving the South. Political deals in Washington weakened protections for black citizens. Southern states regained full control, and the jails kept growing. Isaiah's chain gang marched for miles before reaching a cotton plantation. The fields stretched wide and empty. The overseer didn't care about names. He only counted bodies. The men were given tools. Guards watched with shotguns. Work began before sunrise and ended long after dark. Anyone who slowed down faced punishment. Some were whipped. Some were locked in wooden boxes overnight. Some were shot while attempting escape. Records were poorly kept. Deaths were rarely investigated. To the state, these men were numbers. To their families, they were missing. Weeks passed. Isaiah's hands blistered and bled. His ankles rubbed raw against iron. He watched 2 men collapse from heat. One never stood again. At night, the men whispered stories. I was arrested for not stepping off the sidewalk fast enough. I was charged for arguing over wages. I never even saw a courtroom. Their voices carried pain and confusion. Weren't they free? But in Reconstruction jails, freedom had limits. Meanwhile, politicians argued far away in comfortable rooms. Some claimed the prison labor system saved the economy. Others called it a disgrace. Yet the system continued because it made money. States earned thousands of dollars leasing prisoners. Companies profited from nearly free labor. And poor white citizens were often told this system kept crime under control. Fear became a tool. The word criminal replaced the word slave, and many Americans outside the South barely noticed. One rainy afternoon, Isaiah stumbled in the mud. A guard shouted. The butt of a rifle struck his back. He fell hard. For a moment, he did not move. The world blurred. Was this how it would end? Another prisoner reached down quickly to lift him before the guard could strike again. Stand up, he whispered. Don't let them see you weak. Isaiah forced himself to rise. Inside, something changed. He began to understand that this was not just punishment. It was a message.
a warning to every black man who dared to claim freedom, obey, or return to chains. Far beyond that field, in towns and cities, the number of arrests kept rising. Young boys were being sent to prison camps. Fathers disappeared. Mothers searched county records with no answers. Reconstruction was supposed to rebuild a broken nation. Instead, for many, it built new jails. And the worst part? The system was spreading. Other states were watching, learning, copying. Prison had become a business. As night fell over the plantation, Isaiah lay on the hard ground staring at the stars. He remembered the day freedom was announced, the cheers, the tears, the belief that history had turned. Now he felt the weight of iron around his ankle. History had turned, just not in the way anyone expected. And as thunder rolled across the dark sky, a distant sound echoed from beyond the fields. Gunshots. Shouting. Not from guards, from outside the camp. Isaiah lifted his head. Something was happening. Something bigger than one chain gang. And by morning, Reconstruction jails would face a challenge no one saw coming. The gunshots came closer. Isaiah shot up from the dirt as men around him scrambled to their knees. Guards shouted and ran toward the fence line, rifles raised. Horses screamed in panic. The night that had been heavy and still only seconds before now felt alive. Another gunshot cracked through the darkness, then another. A guard near the gate fell backward into the mud. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone outside the camp shouted, "Run!" The words sliced through the air like lightning. Prisoners looked at one another, confused and afraid. Was this a rescue? A trap? If they ran and were caught, they would be shot. If they stayed, they would remain in chains. Isaiah's heart pounded so loudly he thought it might burst. His ankle chain was still locked to the man beside him. Freedom was only a word unless the iron came off. More shouting followed. Figures moved in the dark beyond the fence. Some carried lanterns, others carried guns. But they were not soldiers. They were not federal troops. They were local black farmers and laborers from nearby towns. Word had spread about the brutal conditions inside the convict camp. Word had spread about men dying in fields with no trial and no protection. And tonight, they had come. A guard fired wildly into the dark. Another tried to reload but dropped his bullets in the mud. Chaos swallowed the camp whole. One of the rescuers reached the fence with bolt cutters stolen from a rail yard. Sparks flew as metal bit into iron. "Hold still," the man hissed as he worked on the chain around Isaiah's ankle. Isaiah could barely breathe. The chain snapped open. For the first time in months, his leg felt light. Around him, other prisoners were breaking loose. Some ran into the woods. Some helped others. Some froze in fear, unsure what to do. But the noise was growing louder, and more riders were coming. From the far end of the road, a group of armed white men galloped toward the camp. They had heard the shots. They knew what this meant. To them, this was not rescue. It was rebellion. Isaiah did not think. He ran. Branches whipped against his face as he pushed through the trees. Behind him, the sounds of gunfire and shouting blended into a storm of terror. He did not know who had fallen. He did not know who had escaped. He only knew he could not go back. By dawn, the woods were quiet again. Isaiah lay hidden beneath thick brush, breathing slowly. His ankle was raw and bleeding where the iron had rubbed for months. Every sound made him flinch. He was free, but not safe. By midday, the news spread across the county. Convicts escape. Armed black mob attacks work camp. Dangerous criminals on the loose. That was how white newspapers described it. There was no mention of false arrests, no mention of beatings, No mention of men worked until death. The story was simple. Prisoners had attacked their guards, and now they would be hunted. Posse groups formed quickly. Local sheriffs gathered volunteers. Dogs were brought out to track scent trails. Roads were blocked. The message was clear. Escape would not be tolerated. Within 2 days, many of the escaped men were captured. Some were dragged back in chains, beaten publicly as a warning. Others were shot while resisting arrest. Few questions were asked. Even fewer answers were recorded. Isaiah moved only at night. He avoided roads and farms. Hunger clawed at his stomach. Once, he came close to knocking on a cabin door for help, but fear stopped him. Anyone who helped an escaped convict could be jailed too. That was another quiet rule of Reconstruction jails. Control did not end at the prison gate. It spread outwards, shaping every choice. Meanwhile, in nearby towns, white leaders called emergency meetings. They claimed the escape proved why strict laws were needed. If we loosen our grip, chaos will take over. They spoke of safety, they spoke of order, but what they truly feared was power shifting again. Because the 1870s were already tense. Black citizens were voting. Some were winning elections. Some were speaking openly against convict leasing, and that scared many who had once controlled everything. The prison system was more than punishment. It was protection for the old order. Days passed. Isaiah found shelter in an abandoned shed near a swamp. He survived on stolen corn and rainwater. His body ached, but his mind raced even more. If he were caught, he would likely be killed. If he surrendered, he would return to chains. There was no fair trial waiting, only the same judge, the same laws, the same trap. One evening, as he rested in the shed, he heard soft footsteps outside. He froze. The door creaked open. A young black woman stood there holding a lantern low. "I heard someone was hiding. Are you from the camp?" she whispered. Isaiah nodded slowly.
Her face tightened, not with fear, but with anger. "My brother died there last year," she said. "They said it was sickness, but he was strong. He never came home." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she handed him bread wrapped in cloth. "You can't stay here long," she said. "They're searching every farm." Her name was Ruth. Her family owned a small patch of land, barely enough to survive. Yet even that land was at risk. White neighbors had accused them of unpaid debts more than once. The law often sided against them, because in Reconstruction jails, accusations were enough. Ruth explained that more arrests were happening since the escape. Officers were sweeping through black neighborhoods, claiming they were looking for fugitives. Young men were being stopped at random. Some were jailed simply for not answering fast enough. The escape had given officials an excuse. Fear had returned stronger than before. Isaiah listened carefully. Freedom felt thinner than ever. The federal government, once strong in the South after the Civil War, was slowly pulling back. Political deals in 1877 ended much of Reconstruction. Troops left, protections weakened. Southern states regained control of their courts and prisons fully. And with that control came expansion. New prison camps opened. Convict leasing contracts grew. By the late 1870s, states like Alabama and Georgia were earning a large part of their budgets from leased prisoners. Money spoke loudly, and justice grew quiet. Ruth returned the next night with news. "They caught 3 more men," she said. 2 were beaten in the square. Isaiah clenched his fists. "They say more arrests are coming." The woods no longer felt safe. The towns were not safe. Even the idea of escape to another state felt distant and dangerous. Isaiah realized something chilling. The jail was not just a building, it was a system.
and that system reached everywhere. A week later, the inevitable happened. Just before sunrise, dogs barked near the shed. Voices followed. "Search the area!" Boots stomped through wet grass. Isaiah looked at Ruth. There was no time. She pointed toward the swamp. "Go." He hesitated. "If they catch you helping me." "They already watch us," she said quietly. "Go." Isaiah ran into the shallow water, mud swallowing his feet. He waded deeper, hiding beneath tall reeds as officers passed nearby. Dogs sniffed, men cursed. For hours he remained still. Finally, silence returned. But he knew this could not continue forever. Every escape only tightened the chains for others. Every rescue brought harsher crackdowns. Reconstruction jails were becoming stronger, not weaker. As evening fell, Isaiah stepped cautiously from the swamp. Smoke rose in the distance, from Ruth's farm. His chest tightened. He moved closer through trees. The small cabin stood, but its fence had been torn down. Chickens scattered. A wagon sat outside with 2 armed deputies nearby. And Ruth, she stood in handcuffs. Isaiah felt the world tilt. An officer held a paper in his hand. Harboring a fugitive. That was the charge. Simple, small, powerful. Just like vagrancy, just like loitering, just like all the words that filled Reconstruction jails. Ruth looked toward the trees. For a brief second, their eyes met. She did not cry. She did not plead. She only shook her head slightly. "Do not come out." The deputies pushed her into the wagon. The wheels began to turn, and Isaiah stood frozen in the shadows, realizing something worse than chains. This system did not only capture bodies, it punished anyone who resisted. And as the wagon rolled toward the same jail he had escaped, Isaiah understood that the fight against Reconstruction jails was no longer just about survival. It was about stopping a machine that was growing stronger every day. But how do you fight a system built into the law itself? That answer was coming, and it would change everything. The jail door slammed shut behind Ruth. Isaiah heard the echo of it in his mind long after the wagon disappeared down the road. That same door, the same iron bars, the same system that had chained him now held her. And this time, it was his fault. Night covered the town as Isaiah moved carefully along the edge of the road. He had followed from a distance, staying hidden in tree lines and ditches. He could not let her disappear inside those walls without knowing what would happen next. The county jail stood tall and square in the center of town. A wooden sign hung crooked near the entrance. 2 oil lamps burned on either side of the door. A guard sat in a chair outside, rifle across his knees. Inside those walls, he knew what waited. Cold floors, overcrowded cells, men, and now women, charged with small crimes that carried heavy punishment. Harboring a fugitive, that was Ruth's crime. Helping a man who had been jailed for looking for work. Isaiah felt anger rise inside him, hot and sharp. But anger alone would not break iron. He needed a plan. Inside the jail, Ruth was pushed into a narrow cell. The air smelled of sweat and sickness. A young black boy sat in the corner, no older than 14. "What you in for?" he asked softly. "Helping someone," she answered. He nodded slowly. "They got me for vagrancy. I work for my uncle, but I didn't have the paper with me." She closed her eyes. The pattern was clear. Charge, arrest, fine. If you couldn't pay the fine, you released. It was simple, it was legal, and it was deadly. By morning, Ruth stood before a judge. The courtroom was small and crowded. White townspeople watched from benches. Few spoke. The charge was read quickly. The judge barely looked up. "Guilty," he said, almost before she could speak. A fine was set, far more than her family could afford. Failure to pay meant transfer to a state labor camp, the same kind Isaiah had escaped.
the same kind where men disappeared. Outside the courthouse, whispers spread through the black community, anger mixed with fear. If helping one another led to jail, then silence was the safest path, and silence was exactly what the system wanted. But something had shifted. The escape at the camp had sparked talk across counties. Churches were meeting quietly at night. Ministers spoke carefully but clearly. "This is not justice," one said. "This is bondage wearing a badge." Some white citizens began to notice too. A few northern journalists wrote about convict leasing. They described beatings, deaths, and profits made from prison labor. One article asked a simple question: if slavery is over, why do chains remain? The article traveled beyond the South, and people began asking more questions. Isaiah met secretly with a small group of men and women at an old church on the edge of town. Candles flickered as they spoke in hushed voices. "We cannot keep running," one man said. "They will always catch us." "We cannot keep paying fines," a woman added. "They set them high on purpose." An older preacher leaned forward. "We must shine light on it." "How?" Isaiah asked. "Testify," the preacher said. "Tell what you saw. Tell what they do in those camps." Fear filled the room. Speaking out could mean arrest, but silence meant surrender. Meanwhile, Ruth was transferred in chains to a larger labor camp. Her hands were tied. Guards rode beside the wagon. Inside, she saw rows of men breaking rocks under the sun. She saw a woman collapse from heat while a guard shouted at her to stand. The system did not care about gender. It cared about labor.
At night, prisoners whispered stories. One man had been jailed for failing to step aside fast enough on a sidewalk. Another had been charged with insulting behavior for asking about unpaid wages. The crimes sounded small, but the suffering was not. Ruth listened carefully. She memorized names, places, details. If she survived, she would remember everything. Back in town, Isaiah made a decision. He would not run north. He would not hide in swamps. He would speak. With the help of the preacher, Isaiah met secretly with a traveling reporter from the north. The reporter had heard rumors, but needed proof. Isaiah described the chains, the beatings, the men shot during escape attempts, the deaths unrecorded. The reporter's face grew pale. "Can you swear to this?" he asked. "Yes," Isaiah said. "And others?" "They will speak," Isaiah answered, "if they believe someone is listening." The story was printed weeks later in a northern paper. It described Reconstruction jails as slavery reborn through law. It named counties. It questioned judges. It exposed profits made by leasing prisoners. The article spread. Some called it lies. Others called it truth finally spoken. Federal officials, already pressured by political changes after 1877, faced new attention. Reconstruction was ending, but the prison system remained. Investigations began slowly, very slowly, but they began. In the prison camp, rumors reached Ruth. "They say newspapers are writing about us," someone whispered. Hope flickered carefully. Yet hope was dangerous. Guards grew harsher as talk spread. Whippings increased. Food rations shrank. They believed fear would silence everyone again. One afternoon, a federal inspector arrived unannounced at the camp. His coat was clean, his notebook ready. Guards stiffened. Prisoners lowered their heads. The inspector walked through rows of workers. He saw scars. He saw thin faces. He asked questions. Some prisoners were too afraid to answer, but Ruth stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "We are jailed for small things, sometimes for nothing at all." The guard stepped closer, but the inspector held up a hand. "Continue." She spoke of fines set too high, of families torn apart, of men dying without record, of labor that looked too much like slavery. Silence filled the air when she finished. The inspector wrote quickly. Weeks passed. Pressure built quietly in state offices. Convict leasing contracts were questioned. Some counties reduced arrests, at least for a time. But change came slowly. Too slowly for many already lost. Isaiah waited outside the prison gates the day rumors said Ruth might be released. Her sentence had been shortened after outside attention. Hours passed. Finally, the gate opened. Ruth stepped out, thinner, weaker, but standing. Isaiah moved toward her carefully, almost afraid she might disappear again. They did not speak at first. They simply stood in the open air, free for the moment. Reconstruction jails had not vanished. Convict leasing would continue for years in many states. But something important had happened. The silence had broken. The system had been seen. History would later show that convict leasing slowly faded in the early 1900s after decades of protest and exposure. But in the 1870s, it was still strong, still dangerous, still claiming lives. Isaiah and Ruth walked away from the jail together, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. Freedom was fragile. The law could still twist, but now more people were watching. And when light shines on chains, they begin to weaken. Reconstruction jails had tried to replace slavery with prison walls. They had tried to turn small charges into lifelong control. They had tried to silence entire communities. But voices had risen, and once truth is spoken, it cannot easily be buried again. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden history of Reconstruction jails, stay with us, because the past is not as distant as it seems, and the roots of today's prison system reach deep into these years. Sometimes, the scariest chains are the ones written into law, and understanding them may be the first step to breaking them. The courtroom was packed the day the state hearing began, not because the powerful wanted justice, but because they were afraid of what might be uncovered. Outside, a crowd gathered in silence. Black families stood shoulder to shoulder. Some clutched old arrest papers. Some held nothing but memories of sons and fathers who never returned from prison camps. Inside, state officials shifted nervously in their chairs. For the first time, Reconstruction jails were not just whispers in churches, they were on record. A federal investigator stood and began reading names of prisoners who had died under convict leasing contracts in the past 5 years. The list was long, too long. Ages ranged from 14 to 60. Cause of death was often written the same way: fever, exhaustion, accident. But witnesses told another story: whippings, starvation, gunshots during so-called escape attempts. Isaiah sat in the back row, his hands folded tightly. Ruth sat beside him. Neither spoke. They knew how easily this moment could collapse. A plantation owner was called to testify. He admitted he had leased over 50 prisoners in 1 year alone. "Did you provide medical care?" the investigator asked. "We provided what was necessary," the man replied coldly. "And how many died under your supervision?" The man hesitated. "I do not recall exact numbers." A murmur moved through the room, because the numbers were not small. In some counties during the 1870s, death rates for convict leasing prisoners were higher than during slavery itself. That was the truth no one wanted printed. A jail official took the stand next. "Are arrests for vagrancy common?" the investigator asked. "Yes," the official answered. "Order." "Order," the investigator repeated slowly. "Or labor supply?" The room fell silent. That question cut deep, because by the late 1870s, prison labor had become one of the South's largest sources of income. States balanced budgets on leased bodies. Reconstruction had promised protection. Instead, it had built a system where arrest became business. Outside the courthouse, tension rose. Some white citizens called the hearings an attack on Southern independence. They claimed outsiders didn't understand their way of life.
But families who had lost loved ones knew the truth didn't belong to one region. It belonged to the dead. The hearings lasted weeks. Witness after witness stepped forward. A young man described being arrested for insulting gestures after laughing in public. An elderly woman told of her son jailed for not carrying proof of employment while walking to find work. A former guard, now shaken by guilt, admitted prisoners were whipped for slowing down. Each story added weight. Each story cracked the wall a little more. But systems built on profit do not fall easily. Behind closed doors, powerful businessmen pressured lawmakers. If Convict leasing ends, our farms will collapse, railroads will stop, mines will close. Fear shifted from control to economy, and money often wins arguments. One evening, as Isaiah and Ruth walked home from the courthouse, they noticed shadows following them. 3 men stepped from an alley, faces hidden.
"Rifles visible," one of them said quietly. Isaiah felt Ruth's hand tighten around his. "We are only telling the truth," he answered. The man stepped closer. "Truth can be dangerous." For a long second, no one moved. Then a door opened nearby. Neighbors stepped outside, watching. The 3 men backed away slowly and disappeared into the night. The message had been delivered. Speaking out carried risk, but silence carried chains. Weeks later, the hearings ended. The final report did not destroy convict leasing overnight, but it exposed it. Some contracts were canceled, some camps were shut down. A few officials resigned quietly. Newspapers across the country debated the findings. The North criticized the South defended itself. But something deeper had changed. The idea that prison could replace slavery had been spoken aloud, and once spoken, it could not be erased. By the early 1880s, arrests for vagrancy in certain counties began to decline, not because justice had suddenly grown strong, but because eyes were watching more closely. Convict leasing would continue in many states for decades, but the foundation had cracked. Isaiah found work at a small lumberyard owned by a man willing to pay fairly. Ruth began teaching children in her community to read and write. "Why reading?" someone once asked her. "Because the law is written, and if we cannot read it, we cannot fight it." The scars on Isaiah's ankle never faded. Some nights he woke suddenly, hearing chains in his dreams. But he also saw something else now. Meetings held openly, petitions signed, communities standing together instead of hiding apart. Reconstruction as a political era was ending. Federal troops had long since withdrawn. Southern states regained full control of their governments, and with that control came new systems, some fair, many not. Reconstruction jails did not disappear overnight. They changed shape, they evolved. In the years that followed, new laws would rise, segregation would tighten, the prison system would grow larger and more complex. But the story of the 1870s remained important because it showed how quickly freedom could shrink when fear and profit mix with law. It showed how minor charges could rebuild chains. It showed how silence feeds injustice. And it showed that even in the darkest systems, voices matter. One quiet afternoon, Isaiah stood outside the old county jail. The building still stood, the sign still hung crooked, but something felt different. He was not looking at it as prey. He was looking at it as proof. Proof that systems can be challenged. Proof that truth can spread beyond walls. Proof that history remembers. Ruth joined him. "Do you think it will ever truly end?" she asked softly. Isaiah thought carefully before answering. "I think," he said, "it ends when people refuse to look away." The wind moved gently through the trees. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. Life continued. Reconstruction jails had tried to rewrite freedom. They had tried to turn laws into chains. They had tried to convince a nation that prison was justice. But the truth had survived.
And stories like this remind us that the past is not buried, it shapes the present. If this story kept you listening, it is because it matters, because understanding Reconstruction jails helps us understand where modern prison systems began, because behind every statistic was a name, behind every charge was a life, and behind every chain was a choice made by someone in power. History is not just dates in a book, it is decisions, and the question that remains is simple. When laws are used to control instead of protect, who will stand up and say enough? The answer, as it was in the 1870s, begins with those who refuse to stay silent. And that choice still echoes today. The iron chain lies in a glass case now. It rests quietly inside a small county museum labeled with neat black letters, Convict Leasing Era, 1870s. Visitors walk past it slowly. Some stare, some shake their heads. A few move on quickly, uncomfortable. But that chain once cut into real skin. It once locked around real ankles. It once turned freedom into a lie. And the story of Reconstruction jails did not end when the hearings faded from newspapers. In the years after the investigations, change came, but not all at once. Some prison camps were shut down. A few contracts were canceled. Certain counties reduced arrests for vagrancy because the public was watching more closely. But the system did not vanish. It adapted. Southern states rewrote laws. Instead of black codes, new rules appeared that sounded neutral on paper, but were enforced unevenly. Minor charges still filled jail cells. Fines were still set high. Prison labor continued, though under tighter rules. The language changed. The chains did not. Isaiah and Ruth understood this. They had seen how quickly power reshaped itself. They knew that even when one door closes, another can open in its place. So they kept telling the story. In churches, in schoolhouses, in town meetings, they described what Reconstruction jails had done. They spoke about men arrested for walking without papers, about women jailed for helping neighbors, about boys forced into fields under armed guards. Some people listened with tears in their eyes, some listened with doubt, and some refused to listen at all. But the story kept spreading. By the 1880s and 1890s, reports about convict leasing grew louder. Reformers, black and white, began demanding change. Ministers preached against prison abuse. Journalists published detailed accounts of death rates and beatings. One shocking report revealed that in certain camps, nearly 1 in 4 prisoners died within a single year. That number stunned the public. Even some who had defended the system began to question it. Was this justice, or was it profit disguised as law? Gradually, states started ending convict leasing contracts. Tennessee ended its system in the 1990s after public outrage. Other states followed slowly. By the early 1900s, most convict leasing systems were officially abolished. Officially, but prisons did not empty. Instead, new prison farms were built and run directly by the state. Labor continued, this time under different management. Prisoners still worked fields, built roads, and labored in harsh conditions. Reconstruction jails had planted something deep. The idea that incarceration could control a population. The idea that minor laws could shape major outcomes. The idea that punishment could generate income. And those ideas did not disappear. They evolved.